My friends, as we gather together in this moment of quiet, let us lay aside all the noise that fills the world, the arguments, the debates, the fears, and the many opinions that claim to speak for truth. In recent times, you may have noticed a great deal being said about something called Christ consciousness. Some voices declare that it is the highest truth mankind can know. Others insist that it is deception, an error, perhaps even an attempt to replace God with human imagination. And so the world begins once again to divide itself, not over truth, but over the words that attempt to point toward truth. But here, in the atmosphere of spiritual contemplation, let us come to a different realization. We are not gathered to defend a phrase, nor to fight for a concept, nor to correct the opinions of the world. We are here for one sacred purpose, to touch, to feel, and to know the living presence that Jesus revealed, and that every mystic throughout the ages has experienced within the silent depths of their own being. When Jesus spoke of the Christ, he did not speak of a theory. He spoke of a presence. He spoke of a light. He spoke of a spiritual identity that does not belong to one man alone, but that expresses itself as the life of every individual who turns inward and recognizes the source of their being. You see, the moment we become entangled in arguments about names and definitions, we lose sight of the very presence those words were meant to reveal. Some say this teaching is false, and others say this teaching is new. But truth is neither false nor new. Truth is, the Christ is not a movement, a trend, or a doctrine. It is the eternal nature of God expressed. And whether we use the phrase Christ consciousness or never utter those words once in our lifetime, the truth itself does not change. It is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it exists not as an idea in the mind, but as a living reality in the depth of spiritual awareness. So let us begin here, not with controversy, not with reaction, but with recognition. Let us open ourselves to the possibility that behind every argument about Christ, behind the fears and the claims and the counterclaims, there is a presence, silent, infinite, indivisible, waiting to be acknowledged. And as we proceed together, I ask you to do only this. Do not listen with the mind that seeks to agree or disagree. Listen with that deeper sense within you which knows truth by its own light. For what we explore today is not a concept to be debated, but a reality to be realized. And in that realization, all fear dissolves, all confusion is quieted, and only the one remains. Now let us go a little deeper, and let us do so gently, without haste. For when we approach spiritual truth with hurry, we approach it with the mind, and the mind can only interpret what it already knows. Spiritual truth must be received in stillness, in openness, in that inner listening where the presence itself imparts its own meaning. The great misunderstanding surrounding what is called Christ consciousness arises from this very point. Men try to understand spiritual reality with the human mind, and the human mind, being finite, can only seize upon words, not the essence to which the words point. So one person hears the word Christ and immediately thinks of theology. Another hears the word consciousness and thinks of psychology or philosophy. And between these two interpretations, the living spirit is lost. But you see, words are never truth. Words are symbols. They are shadows of something far greater than any language can carry. And the moment we bind ourselves to a word, the moment we say, this is what the Christ means, or this is what consciousness means, we have replaced revelation with definition. We have chosen the letter over the spirit. You remember Paul's profound statement, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." Why does the letter kill? Because the letter becomes a barrier to the inner realization. Once the mind believes it knows truth, it stops seeking truth. But when the heart is open, when it says, "Father, reveal thyself," then the living activity of spirit begins its work, and understanding flows without effort. The misunderstanding, then, does not lie in the phrase Christ consciousness. The misunderstanding lies in the approach, in the attempt to grasp that which is infinite with that which is limited. When we approach this teaching with the mind, we argue. When we approach it with the spirit, we behold. And this is what I would have you see. It is not the word Christ that brings confusion. It is not the word consciousness. It is the absence of inner realization behind the word. When two people use the same term but speak from different levels of awareness, one from intellect, one from spirit, they will never agree. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because they are speaking from different states of being. Truth is known only in the state of consciousness that can receive it. So let us not react to words, let us not fear them, nor cling to them, nor make them sacred. Instead, let us turn inward and ask, what is the reality behind this expression? What is the Spirit trying to reveal? For when the Spirit reveals itself, the word becomes transparent, and only the presence remains. And when the presence is known, all debate ends not by victory, but by dissolution. As we move forward, let us look with compassion upon the fears that arise. Whenever spiritual truth begins to break through the crust of human belief, it is natural that when the light appears, the shadows seem to lengthen. But remember this, the shadow has no substance of its own. It is merely the appearance created when the mind turns away from the light of its own being. Many sincere individuals fear the phrase Christ consciousness because they believe it seeks to replace God with man, or to elevate the human ego to some divine status. Others fear it because they think it diminishes the uniqueness of Jesus, or that it invites deception, or that it opens the door to pride and spiritual confusion. And let us not dismiss these fears. They arise from deep devotion, deep longing, deep sincerity. But sincerity without spiritual discernment always produces anxiety, because it clings to form rather than essence. Let us then look at these fears for what they are, not signs of truth, but signs of separation. Fear always has one root, the belief that we stand apart from God, that we must protect ourselves from error, from illusion, from darkness. Yet how can that be so? If God truly is the light of our being, how can the presence that formed us, that sustains us, that lives its own life as our life, how can that presence ever be threatened by an idea or a phrase? You see, spiritual fear is nothing more than the mind attempting to guard its own boundaries. It hears a term it cannot understand, and immediately it contracts. But truth is never known through contraction. Truth is known through openness. It is known in the stillness, where the Spirit itself whispers, "Fear not, it is I." If a teaching is false, the Spirit within us reveals its falsity not through fear, but through quiet clarity. And if a teaching is true, the Spirit reveals its truth not through excitement or emotion, but through inner peace. Fear plays no part in the activity of God. So when someone hears the phrase Christ consciousness and feels fear, the fear does not come from the presence. The fear comes from the belief that Christ is something external, something fragile, something that can be distorted by human thought. But Christ is not fragile. Christ is not dependent upon our understanding or our protection. Christ is the living expression of God, the I am that never leaves us nor forsakes us. Let us then release these fears, not by argument, not by force, but by recognizing that the Christ can never be threatened by the human mind. The human mind cannot add to it, nor can it take away from it. The Christ stands as pure spiritual identity, untouched by human interpretation. When you rest in this realization, fear dissolves, not because the outer world becomes safer, but because you discover that your safety never depended upon the world at all. It depended upon the presence, and that presence is your very being. Now, before we enter the true understanding of this subject, it is necessary to clear away the misconceptions that have gathered around it. For if we attempt to build upon a foundation of confusion, the structure will not stand. So let us take a moment to look directly at what the world calls Christ consciousness, and to understand not what it is, but what it is not. Only then can the true nature of the Christ be revealed in its purity. First, Christ consciousness is not the human ego declaring itself divine. The personal I, with all its desires, fears, ambitions, and insecurities, is never the Christ. The Christ does not arise from human will, nor is it something a person can attain by discipline, effort, or self-affirmation. The moment the personal self tries to claim divinity, it creates the very deception so many people fear, for the human self has no capacity to be divine. It has no life of its own. It is but a shadow, a temporary appearance upon the screen of consciousness. Second, Christ. Consciousness is not self-improvement. It is not a newer, stronger, wiser version of the human mind. It is not a mystical upgrade to the personality. The Christ does not perfect the human being. It reveals the truth that the human being was never the center of existence to begin with. You cannot polish the shell and call it the pearl. The pearl is within. Third, Christ consciousness is not a technique for power or manifestation. It offers no magical abilities, no psychic gifts, no tools to manipulate the world of form. The Christ is the absence of manipulation. It is the recognition that God alone is the activity, the substance, and the law of all that appears. When you seek the Christ for power, you lose it. When you seek the Christ for truth, power is unnecessary. Fourth, Christ consciousness is not a replacement for Jesus, nor a denial of his role. Jesus was the clearest expression of Christ the world has known. But even he said, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one." He pointed always beyond the personal self to the Father within. To recognize Christ's consciousness is not to diminish Jesus. It is to honor him by understanding the reality he embodied. Fifth, Christ consciousness is not an elite attainment reserved for a few mystics or spiritual prodigies. It is not the property of a special class of enlightened individuals. It is the birthright of every soul, for it is the reality of every soul. What makes it seem rare is not its nature, but our forgetfulness. The Christ stands at the door of consciousness in every person, but few open the door. Sixth, Christ consciousness is not a religion. It cannot be institutionalized, cannot be packaged into creeds, cannot be owned by any church or movement. It does not require adherence to any tradition. The Christ is the inner activity of God revealing itself to individual consciousness, and it transcends every boundary created by human thought. And seventh, Christ consciousness is not something new. Truth never comes into existence. Truth simply becomes recognized. The Christ existed before Abraham was, before any scripture was written, before any doctrine was formed. It is the eternal presence that has always been and that forever will be. When these misunderstandings are removed, when we see what Christ consciousness is not, then a great stillness begins to form in us. The mind ceases grasping, the emotions cease reacting, and into that stillness, the true revelation of the Christ can enter. For now, let us simply rest in this clarity. The Christ is not an achievement, not a belief, not a human claim. It is the nature of God expressing as your very self. And now, having cleared the ground of misunderstanding, we can begin to approach the truth, not the truth as theory, nor the truth as belief, but the truth as direct revelation. For Christ is not something that can be explained adequately with words. It can only be known in the moment it reveals itself within your consciousness, but words may point the way, and so we use them gently, reverently, knowing they are only the finger pointing toward the moon, not the moon itself. What then did we mean when we use the word Christ? And what did Jesus mean when he spoke of the Christ? And what did every mystic throughout the ages feel when they touched that inner light that dissolves the barriers of fear and separation? Joel Goldsmith taught that the Christ is the spiritual identity of every individual, the divine essence that stands behind the appearance of personhood. It is not the body you see in the mirror. It is not the personality that changes with circumstance and mood. It is not your memories, your temperament, your beliefs, your talents, or your struggles. These are but garments worn for a moment in time. Christ is the I am that existed before any of these garments appeared. When Moses heard the voice say, "I am that I am," it was not a personal being speaking from a bush. It was the Christ announcing itself, the eternal presence, declaring its own nature. When Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," he was not speaking of the man Jesus. He was speaking of the Christ, appearing as Jesus. And when he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he was not excluding mankind. He was revealing what mankind truly is beneath the veil of personal identity. For the Christ is not a person. The Christ is a presence. The Christ is not limited to one time or place. The Christ is eternal. The Christ is not an exclusive possession. The Christ is universal. The Christ is the activity of God made visible as individual being. Goldsmith would often say that Christ is God individualized, not God divided, not God fragmented, not God parceled out, but God expressing itself as infinite forms of one life, one being, one consciousness. When you look upon a person, any person, regardless of appearance, you are beholding a form in which the Christ abides. Whether recognized or not, when you look upon yourself, what you call me is only the surface. Beneath that surface, closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, shines the same Christ. This is why the Christ cannot be owned by any religion. It cannot be confined to a creed or a temple. It cannot be imprisoned in dogma or tradition. The Christ is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And if it lighteth every man, then it also lights you, not one day, not after long purification, not as a reward for righteousness, now in this moment as your own being, but the mind does not recognize it. The senses do not perceive it. The personal I does not understand it. Only the spirit within you knows its own nature. And when the personal self grows quiet enough to let that inner knowing rise, then you begin to feel something, a quiet joy, a gentle peace, an unexplainable certainty. Not about doctrine, not about belief, but about being itself. This is the Christ. Not a doctrine, not a controversy, not a movement, not an achievement, a living presence, the true I of every individual. And when this dawns upon you, you will find that you no longer ask, "What is Christ consciousness?" Nor do you fear the term, for you will know without words that the Christ is the light within you, the life that animates you, the presence that lives you, and once that is seen, the world cannot take it from you. And now, let us look closely at the cause of all confusion, all distortion, all spiritual struggle, for every misunderstanding that arises around the word Christ, and every argument that forms around the idea of consciousness can be traced to one simple error. The personal sense of self attempts to grasp what belongs only to spiritual awareness. The personal self, this I that we have believed ourselves to be, is a bundle of past experiences, memories, beliefs, desires, fears, and opinions. It is not evil, nor is it to be condemned, but it is limited, it is finite, and because it is limited, it cannot receive the infinite. It cannot understand the presence that transcends all boundaries. It cannot hold within itself the truth that has no shape, no form, no beginning, and no end. And yet this personal sense tries, it hears the word Christ and attempts to define it through the intellect. It hears the word consciousness and attempts to analyze it. It tries to capture the infinite with the net of finite understanding, and in doing so, it becomes frustrated, afraid, or proud. This is the source of every spiritual misstep. The human mind tries to be the instrument of divine revelation, but the human mind is not that instrument. It was never designed to be. It can memorize scripture. It can repeat doctrine. It can argue theology. It can organize religion, but it cannot receive spiritual truth. It cannot behold God. Only the spirit within you can behold the spirit that is God. Joel Goldsmith often said, "The human mind is not the avenue of spiritual wisdom," and this must be understood deeply. For the moment we attempt to understand God intellectually, we create a concept of God. And a concept is not God. A concept is an image formed from the materials of the mind, memory, imagination, logic, emotion. These are shadows of truth, not truth itself. So the great error is not in using the phrase Christ consciousness. The great error is in the place from which we try to understand it. If we approach it with the mind, we create confusion. If we approach it with fear, we create resistance. If we approach it with desire, we create fantasy. But when we approach it in stillness, with no desire to grasp or to claim or to become, then the spirit itself reveals what the mind could never contain. Let us be clear. The personal I cannot awaken. The personal I cannot become divine. The personal I cannot attain Christ consciousness. It is not the human who becomes the Christ. It is the Christhood that reveals the unreality of the human. When we believe that our human self can rise into divinity, we fall into illusion. But when the human self becomes still, silent, surrendered, when it ceases striving, ceases claiming, ceases seeking, then something miraculous begins to take place, not as an effort, but as grace. The Christ within begins to reveal itself, not as a doctrine, not as a mystical experience, but as the simple, direct awareness of being. You may notice this in moments of profound peace, when the mind rests and something deeper shines forth, or in moments when fear dissolves for no reason, or when love wells up without an object, or when life seems to flow through you without your guiding it. These are glimpses not of a human becoming divine, but of the divine revealing itself as your true nature. Therefore, the great error is not that people speak of Christ consciousness. The great error is believing that the personal self is the center of spiritual life, but when this personal sense grows quiet, when it steps aside and stops trying to understand, then the infinite becomes visible. The Christ stands revealed not as something achieved, but as something eternally present. And in that moment, without language, without concept, without argument, that the Christ was never missing, never distant, never waiting for you to reach. It has always been the I that lives itself as you. Let us now come to the turning point of the spiritual life, the moment of recognition. For all the teachings, all the scriptures, all the meditation in the world are but preparation for this one simple shift. The shift from identifying yourself as a person to recognizing yourself as presence. This recognition does not come through effort. It does not come through study. It does not come because you try to understand God or try to become spiritual. It comes the moment you begin to question the identity you have assumed since childhood. It begins when you pause and ask, very quietly, who is the I that is aware right now? You may think you know the answer. You may say, I am this body, or I am this personality, or I am this mind, these emotions, these memories. But if you look just a little deeper, you will notice something remarkable. Everything you can describe about yourself is something you observe. The body appears and ages, the mind thinks and stops thinking, emotions rise and fall, memory fades and returns. But the one who observes all these changes does not change. That observer, silent, invisible, unchanging, is the Christ within you. When you say, I think, who is the I that notices the thought? When you say, I feel, who is the I that is aware of the feeling? When you say, I fear, who is the I that witnesses the fear? Arise and dissolve. And when you sit in stillness, and there is no thought, no feeling, no movement, what remains? That which remains is the presence. And that presence is the Christ. The personal self cannot make this recognition. It cannot force it, cannot will it, cannot reason its way into it. The personal self is dissolved by it. But the moment you become still enough to notice that every thought about I is not the real I, the moment the false identification slips away, there is a gentle, effortless realization. I am not this limited sense of self. I am the presence that beholds it. This is not imagination. It is not affirmation. It is not a mantra. It is pure recognition. And with that recognition comes a quiet shift. You begin to understand that the problems you believed were yours belong only to the personal sense of self, the self you are no longer identifying with. The fear, the lack, the guilt, the striving, all of these belong to the false I. They were never the burden of your true self. As you rest in this newfound awareness, even for a moment, something profound begins to occur. The grip of personal identity loosens, the urgency of human living softens. A peace that does not depend upon circumstances rises from within, and you discover that the I you thought you were, the anxious, striving, fearing self, was never you at all. It was a dream image, a shadow cast upon the surface of consciousness, but the true I, the Christ I am, is the light behind the shadow. Once this is glimpsed, even faintly, life begins to unfold differently. You no longer move from fear but from presence. You no longer seek God as something outside of you because you feel God is the very essence of your being. You no longer strive to fix the world because you realize that the world that needs fixing is the world seen through the lens of personal sense. When that lens falls away, what remains is harmony not created by you, but revealed to you. This recognition is the beginning of spiritual life. Everything before it is preparation, everything after it is deepening. But the recognition itself, the moment you shift from person to presence, is the moment the Christ stands revealed within your own consciousness. It is the moment you awaken to what has always been true. For the Christ does not come to you. The Christ is uncovered in you. It does not descend from above. It emerges from within. It does not require your belief. It requires your surrender. When this dawns upon you not as an idea, but as experience, you know that the truth Jesus lived, the truth the mystics realized, the truth Goldsmith taught, is nothing less than the truth of your own being. Once this recognition begins to dawn, once you have even the faintest awareness that the true I of your being is not the personal self, but the infinite presence, you will notice that life starts to unfold in a new and quieter rhythm, not because you have tried to change your outer circumstances, but because something within has shifted. You are no longer living from the sense of me trying to live life. Life begins to live itself as you. This is what we mean when we say living the Christ identity. It is not a new behavior. It is not a new role you play. It is not a spiritual persona you create. It is the natural fruit that appears the moment the inner tree is recognized. The Christ is the root. Harmony is the fruit. The Christ is the light. Peace is its reflection. The Christ is the presence. Healing is its evidence. And these fruits appear without effort, without strain, without the pressure to achieve. Let us look gently at the ways this manifests. First, when you live from the Christ identity, fear begins to dissolve. Not because you work at eliminating fear, but because you no longer identify with the self that can be threatened. Fear belongs to the personal sense of life. The Christ knows nothing of it. So as you rest in the I am, fear loses its power. It has no foothold, for it no longer finds an identity in you through which to operate. Second, you discover that supply flows more naturally. You cease to look to people, jobs, circumstances, or outer channels as your source. You begin to feel deeply, quietly, that I am is supply. Not that supply comes to you, but that supply lives as you. When this is realized, the anxiety around money, opportunity, and provision gently loosens. You take whatever actions are necessary, but you are no longer driven by fear, and therefore your actions are guided rather than forced. Third, healing begins to arise without effort. This does not mean the body must always be perfect according to human standards. It means the sense of being a body with a problem softens. You recognize that the I which you are is untouched by disease, untouched by age, untouched by the conditions of matter. And as that realization deepens, many physical struggles simply dissolve in the light of truth, not because you have attempted to heal them, but because you have ceased to identify with the self that suffers from them. Fourth, relationships transform. When you recognize the Christ as your identity, you begin to recognize it as the identity of every individual regardless of their behavior. You no longer react to the mask others wear. You see behind the mask to the presence that stands there silently. This does not mean you accept harmful behavior or become passive. It means your responses become rooted in clarity, not in fear or judgment. Love arises naturally, not sentimental love, but the love that sees truth in spite of appearances. Fifth, judgment fades. Judgment is the activity of the personal self, comparing one image with another. The Christ does not judge, because the Christ sees only itself as this vision opens within you. The harshness you once had toward yourself softens. The harshness you once had toward others dissolves. You begin to live in a quiet freedom, free of condemnation, free of self-attack, free of resentment. Sixth, inner peace becomes the atmosphere of your life, not a peace that is created by silence or meditation, but a peace that flows from the realization that your being is sustained by the presence, not by human effort. When you stop trying to manage life, life manages itself. When you stop trying to understand the plan, you see the plan unfolding moment by moment as grace. And seventh, the need to argue, to defend, to explain disappears. For when the Christ is recognized, truth becomes self-evident. You no longer feel compelled to convince anyone. You no longer feel threatened by differing views. You live in a sense of inner freedom, knowing that truth is not something that needs your protection. Truth protects itself by its very nature. This, then, is living from the Christ identity, not a new behavior or a new belief, but the quiet unfolding of life as it is meant to be lived. The Christ within you is not waiting for you to become spiritual. It is waiting for you to become still, that it may reveal itself. No human being can live the Christ life, but the Christ can live its life as you. The moment you cease striving and begin resting in the truth of your being. And now, as we come to the close of our time together, let us enter the deepest and most essential truth of all, that the Christ cannot be understood through speech, nor fully conveyed through teaching, nor captured by any phrase, whether praised or criticized. All that we have said here, all that has been offered in gentle explanation, is but the preparation for something infinitely more real than words. For spiritual truth is never contained in the mind. It is revealed only in the stillness of your own being. You may notice that throughout our exploration, something in you has grown quieter, something has softened, something has become more spacious. That is not due to the words themselves. It is due to the activity of the presence within you, responding to the recognition of its own nature. For the Christ does not lie in the future. It does not lie in intellectual understanding. It does not lie in the mastery of spiritual concepts. The Christ is the eye of you, the very light of your consciousness, awaiting nothing but your willingness to be still. If you were to forget every word spoken here And remember only this, it would be enough. The Christ is the true identity of your being. It cannot be threatened, cannot be argued, cannot be diminished, and cannot be lost. Whether the world accepts this or rejects it, whether language confuses it or clarifies it, whether beliefs support it or contradict it, none of these change the truth. The truth stands silently, eternally, as the foundation of your existence. So do not concern yourself with the questions that trouble the world. Is Christ consciousness true? Is it false? Is it a danger? Is it a deception? These questions arise only when we are still identified with the personal mind. When the Christ within you is recognized, the questions dissolve of themselves, not because you have found the correct answers, but because you have discovered that the questioner was never the real you. From this moment on, I invite you to practice only one thing. Whenever you find yourself confused, fearful, defensive, or uncertain, pause just for a breath and gently ask, who is the I experiencing this? And as you sit with that question, without hurry, without strain, without searching for an answer, you will begin to feel a subtle shift. The personal I, with all its burdens, begins to recede, and the true I, the Christ, begins to reveal itself as peace, as clarity, as presence. This revelation does not need your belief. It does not need your effort. It does not need your perfection. It needs only your willingness to be still. So we leave this teaching not with more knowledge, but with a deeper silence, not with certainty of words, but with certainty of presence, not with an idea of Christ, but with the living Christ shining quietly as your very self. Let us rest. Then, in that which is eternal, let us rest in the I am that was before all thought. Let us rest in the presence that needs no defense and offers no argument. And as we rest, let us allow the Christ to reveal itself in its own way, in its own time, as your own being. And in that revelation, all doubts end, all fears dissolve, and only the one remains.